So I'm going to introduce Adam Davis now. So I know Adam for a long time, but I'll just begin with the sort of objective details about his life that qualify him to be a speaker here and in our series. So right now he's the executive director of Oregon Humanities, and that's an organization that, here's their mission: they invite diverse perspectives, ask challenging questions, and strive for just communities. And prior to that, Adam was the founder of the Center for Civic Reflection. And was involved in, he trained discussion leaders for various service organizations, including AmeriCorps. When I knew him at Chicago, he was doing part-time writing a dissertation on Rousseau, and he also managed at the same time to found and lead Camp of Dreams, which was a program for underserved youth in the Chicagoland area, a summer program that turned into a year-long cultural, social support. He also found the time to kick my ass in basketball continually. I thought I'd throw that in there. And now I think I want to say something about why I think he's a really good speaker for us at our school. It will not have escaped your notice that at this school we seem to be interested in two things. We seem to be interested in serious reflection, and we're interested in civic engagement or doing good in the world. And it's not obvious to me how those two things fit together. It seems like serious reflection is the kind of thing that requires self-knowledge of ignorance and proceeds out of a posture of unknowing, but seeking the good. And it seems like civic engagement has to involve on the part of the person who's acting some kind of confidence that they know what the good is and more or less how to get there. And so it's not obvious why our school can do both of these things in a happy way. It's not obvious to me how those two things understood as ideas might fit together. But I also have to say that the more I stay in the academy, the less interested I am in how ideas fit together, and the more interested I become in how ideas reveal themselves or are lived in the lives of actual persons. And there's no person that I know to better speak about how these things might fit together, serious reflection and serious civic engagement, than the person I'm proud to call my friend. So Adam, please help us tonight.
That's really thoughtful and generous introduction. It's good to hear a couple objective details, just to remember who objectively I am. Thank you, Ava, for getting me over here, and Aaron for helping, and David for that generous introduction. It's interesting. I was waiting to try to figure out what to talk about, and I should say there's not going to be a talk in the way some talks are talks, which means I'm going to ask you to do some talking with each other and some with me. But I wasn't sure what exactly to talk about. In part, there was the series on popular sovereignty, and in part, there was the question of who's going to be in the room. A question I only still know the least bit about an answer to. And in part, I think, was the question of why this person here now. So hoping to combine some of those three things over the next little bit. And I want to start, I guess, with a little bit more on the popular sovereignty angle, and then move towards what David was saying about the relationship between reflection on one side and civic engagement on the other. Sound all right? Yeah? Jack's shaking his head a little bit. Hopefully that's positive. So popular sovereignty is a term that I learned really through Ava about a year and a half ago through this initiative. And I'm still trying to get my head around. I still don't fully know what it means. But for me, shorthand is self-rule. The idea that a group of people, maybe even a politically bounded group of people can rule itself, is ultimately responsible for the stuff that happens to it, determines it. But that's a working shorthand for me. And so what I'm hoping is to do some thinking with you about self-rule as a possibility and conditions that might be required to get there. It's a big area I hope we'll go, and I hope we'll get to the strange work I do in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and sometimes around the country as a way to get there. Before diving in, I actually want to ask a question, and I just want to, with the ideal of self-rule in mind, I'd love if a couple people were bold enough to say, like if you had to think about one action that you think is necessary as a part of self-rule, an action that would contribute to our capacity to rule ourselves, what would that be? One of what you think might be a most important action. And I'm going to ask you to say it as a verb without explaining. So in other words, I want one word from a few different people that you think, this is an important word if we're thinking about self-rule. It's an important activity. And maybe I could just name what some people might say would be the most important one as a way of getting that named and then off the table to get some others in. Voting. There's a nod back there. Is that what you're thinking?
I was about to say it.
Okay, and what is your name?
Sammy.
Sammy? Okay, so voting is what you were thinking?
Yeah.
Thank you. I was too. Let's get a few more words out.
Farming.
Farming. And what is your name?
Cyrus.
Cyrus, thank you. Great.
Donating.
Donating. And what is your name?
Sarah.
Sarah? Okay, so maybe before you say your word, if you've got one, maybe also just say your name. That's, I guess, the pattern that I've established. Yeah.
Xenia. And it's listening.
Listening. Okay, thank you. And Xenia? Thanks.
Rebecca, communicating.
Okay, Rebecca, communicating.
Omar, commitment.
Okay, so, and if we're putting in terms of a verb, Omar would say committing. Okay, so this is already a super interesting mix. And it's a bigger spread than I expected, which is great.
Spencer, compromising.
Spencer, compromising. All right, great.
Inclusion or including?
Including. Okay. It's interesting how few of these words are obviously institutional or legal words. So I guess I just want to note that right off the bat, that if we're thinking about the conditions for us as a community to rule ourselves, it's interesting that so many of these words seem to reside in a place that's somewhere other than the institutional or legal framework, primarily. Because often, I think the way democracies function is to go immediately to the institutional or the legal. Just want to note that for starters. And it's interesting even thinking about something like farming. Just thinking, okay, somehow the food we grow and the way we grow it may have something to do with our capacity to rule ourselves, how we communicate, whether we listen. And I was going to save listening. That was the one I was going to say. So I'm glad it got said. And we're going to come back to listening. Listening's going to be a big thing that I think I'm at least going to come back to a bunch. So what I want to do now, though, is I want to ask a second question, also with a short response, if that's okay. And now I just want to ask a few people to name what you think is one of the biggest obstacles you can think of to self-rule. Something that gets in the way of our capacity to do it. And again, don't explain it, just maybe name one. And let's try to get people that haven't yet jumped in, if that works.
Self-knowing.
Self-knowing. Chris. Self-knowing. It would have been okay to say, I don't even know my name after saying self-knowing. Yeah.
Aaron, corruption.
All right. Self-knowing, corruption.
Rent-seeking.
Rent-seeking.
Yes.
So Spencer back in with rent-seeking. Let's try to get folks that haven't jumped in yet, if it's possible.
Ego.
Ego.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Also not so institutional, fairly psychological. All right. A couple more.
Claire, colonization.
Colonization. Okay. Thank you.
The concept itself.
The concept itself, and can you say your name?
Florian.
Florian. The concept of self-rule itself.
When applied to communities, bodies, yes,
Yeah.
polities.
Polities. Yeah. Groups of people on a Thursday night. Like, what would it mean for us to rule ourselves right here? What would be the obstacles if we said, okay, within an hour, let's make sure we can rule ourselves? That thought inspires laughter. And yet we try to do it in very complex groupings of people without a whole lot of attention to exactly how we're going to do it. Any more obstacles that people want to name right off the bat, Ava?
Unwillingness to assume responsibility.
Okay, unwillingness to assume responsibility. All right, the obstacles are mounting. Any more to name? Yeah, dude.
Boredom.
Boredom. I don't want to do this. I want to go play basketball. Any more that you feel like are pressing? Yeah.
Cultural appropriations.
Can you say one more word about what you said? Cultural appropriation. What do you mean?
So like in some places you want to work, you come as an outsider and you just decide that you know it all.
Okay, so I hear at least two things there. One is the presumption of knowing more. The other is like outsider, insider. And at least so I'm living in the United States right now, and actually it's around outsider, insider stuff, or divides in general, that the whole concept of self-rule, the concept itself runs into challenges. Especially around the idea of there even being a people that could rule itself. Any people that could rule itself. So I guess I want to suggest right off the bat that if we're thinking about self-rule, and we're thinking about a people ruling itself, many of these challenges are wrapped up with the challenge of there existing a people unified enough to call itself a people, and to try to do things together as some sort of whole. Even before we get into what it is they do and how it is they do is there a people that exists, and how do we know that that people exists? And in the country I come from, long tradition of saying things like "we the people," or a government of, by, and for the people. But the creation of constitution and recognition of the people is pretty challenging, always. And maybe if you read the news now, people say more now than ever. And I know, at least from reading some other news, that that's said of other countries now as well. Yeah? Let me just stop for a minute. Anything there that sounds like people want to jump in on? Because I'm about to ask you to talk to each other a little bit in smaller groups. Okay, great.
I think people is a very, echoing Florian, and the concept is obstacle. People is a concept that stands as an obstacle. The whole notion is problematic, but the self-rule requires a self, a kind of collective
Great.
self, right? So maybe we can broaden that
Sure.
to jump over the hurdle of the people to the idea of a collective self, what that
Yep.
is.
Great, that's really helpful. And that's, I think, the way, when I boil it down in my head, when I move from popular sovereignty to self-rule, that's what I'm doing. I'm thinking, okay, what's the self that's going to rule itself? And what does self-rule require, whether it's in an individual or a group? And if it's in a large group, self-rule seems really complicated. And if I boil it back down, it's sort of the reverse of the way Plato does in the Republic, where he moves from an individual to a city. If we go backwards and go, if we're already presuming about what popular sovereignty requires, what if we go the other way? What if we go, what does an individual need in order to rule herself? We might say, well, she would need to know herself. She would need to understand herself, if we have any hope for self-rule. And then the question is, okay, how is it that we come to understand our collective self? And we don't have a lot of institutional help with that. And when I say we there, and I should be careful every time I say we, because in a way I'm constituting a collective self every time I say we. But when I say we don't have a lot of help with that, I mean first and foremost the United States, a vast, large, diverse nation that still likes to talk about a people. But I think it applies to a lot of countries, that there's claims made about the we, which quickly become hard to sustain and have become more difficult to sustain as the world has grown more complicated and connected. So I want to actually read something very short from a guy named John Dewey. John Dewey ring a bell for some people? A book called The Public and Its Problems. Again, I guess I want to go back because I got to sit in on a Plato class earlier today, and because David just mentioned Rousseau, which used to be a bigger part of my life than he is now. Rousseau. Here's what Dewey said in about 100 years ago. The notion of maintaining a unified state even nominally self-governing, over a country as extended as the United States and consisting of a large and racially diversified population would once have seemed the wildest of fancies. It seemed almost self-evident to Plato, as to Rousseau later, that a genuine state could hardly be larger than the number of persons capable of personal acquaintance with one another. Capable of personal acquaintance with one another. So in a way, one of the things I want to do tonight, I guess, and I think this is getting back to David's question about the relationship between reflection and civic engagement, is think about how is it that we get personally acquainted with each other, especially in a world characterized by globalization, difference, divides, all sorts of divides. And it's divides that especially seem now to get in the way of the capacity to constitute a collective self and rule that collective self in some way that feels like we all have agency in it. Stay committed to it, to use a word that came up earlier. So what I want to ask, I want to go directly at divides for a little bit. Because I think one of the fundamental challenges to self-rule is fracture, or the lack of a sense of a collective self, to go to the term that Ava said. So I'm going to ask you actually for about, we're going to do this in 2 short stages. I'm going to ask you first to get in a group no bigger than 3, so either 2 or 3 of you. And I would encourage you, I'm going to ask you to break up differently in a minute, so if it's easy to stay where you are. But if you're sitting next to someone you don't know, even better than if you're sitting next to someone you do know. Smiles in the back, that's good. I want you to think and talk about one divide or significant difference that you perceive in the Bard College Berlin community. A divide that you're aware of. You just sense that the divide shows up for you in some significant way. And I'm going to give you like 4 minutes total for all 3 of you to talk. Then I'm going to try to interrupt and I'm going to ask you something else. Is it clear what I'm asking? Please have at it. I'll interrupt in 4 minutes. One divide in this community, the Bard College Berlin community. All right, I'm going to interrupt you because I know at least one group is finished. I apologize for interrupting.
To be continued.
Sort of. I like the way. Can I ask real quick for a few of those before I ask you to break up again? Just let's throw a few divides out. Don't explain them, just say what they are.
Those who go to lunch and those who don't.
Those who go to lunch and those who don't. It's great when you name a divide and people laugh. That's good. Because many don't inspire that reaction, but that's a good start. Those who go to lunch and those who don't. Let's get some more.
Culture.
Say it again.
Critical versus non-critical.
Critical versus non-critical. Okay.
Culture again.
What do you mean by culture?
Because we are well known for having students from all around the world, but then when we come back to campus, it's go back to American style.
American
So I
style.
don't feel like we're adding anything from our culture to that.
Okay, so, thank you. That helps very quickly understand cultural divides. Yeah.
Languages?
Languages, yeah. Seems like a big one. Yeah.
Concentrations.
Concentrations, what you care about, what you study. All right, a couple more.
Well, those who care about reflection and those who care about action.
Those who care about reflection and those who care about action.
Is that yours?
All right. So,
We're stealing from the same source.
Mine is actually the same active versus contemplative.
active versus contemplative. Okay, great. So those are a good start here. And it didn't feel like anybody got too tense, although some of the stuff that people named actually can get tense real quick. And actually is like real serious. Even down to the active contemplative can get serious, although that's not one of the ones I most had in mind is tense. All right, I'm going to ask you to split up with different people this time. So I'm actually going to, it may require standing up. Don't need to stand yet. Here's what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to give you 5 minutes this time. And this time, it was nice, implicit in your comment was that many of you come from other places. So now I'm going to ask you to think about your home community. And you can think about the scale of that community how you want. In other words, is it your town, your region, your province, your state, or your nation? You decide. But I want you to think about one divide that you detect that feels kind of serious in your home community. A divide that feels kind of serious in your home community. So please don't talk with the same people you talked with last time. And I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes and I'm gonna interrupt you again. So use this space too if that's easy. Let me ask, did anyone have trouble thinking of a divide in their home community? A significant divide? Okay, a few people did. That seems like it might be good news. Let's get some of the divides people did think of.
Well, in my hometown, I come from a small town in the U.S. and our high school team, like a football team, the mascot is like Native American leader.
Yeah.
And so every year there's a fight between the people who really like this mascot and people who really hate, like think we should get rid of it.
Okay.
And every year this is like a conflict and like it's been voted on and like things like this.
Okay. So the mascot represents cultural divides, divides of conviction and belief,
Yeah.
maybe a sense of who we are in some way. Maybe we should just get rid of football.
In our country, the whole country is being governed by traditional politics since a century almost. And this traditional politics is somehow rooted in like detailed things like ethnicity, language, religion, and belief. So this traditional politics has really, really divided the country.
Okay, so the form of politics, but also how it reflects other divides, language, belief, the groups people belong to. There's lots buried in that. Yeah.
Religion.
Religion,
I come from Syria. So.
period.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. And that hadn't been named yet, and that seems like a really big one. It's related to all sorts of other traditions we inherit. Couple more, yeah.
Racism.
Racism,
I
or
come from a small town in Nevada where all the workers are Hispanic, Muslim, Mexican origin, and all of the owners of the things that they farm are like second, third generation European descent, and it's a very racist community.
okay, I hear again a few divides in there. The one you named was racism, but you also said for the second time already, somebody said, I come from a small town. So I hear a kind of urban-rural divide, which is also sometimes shows up as a geographic divide. And then there was a who owns the stuff and who does the work on the stuff kind of divide. Sorry, go ahead, Spencer.
Just the urban-rural divide. I'm from Chicago, and there's like a movement to turn, it's a sort of a small movement, but it's big enough to turn Chicago into the 51st state. I don't know what the opposite of annexation is, but like the rest of Illinois wants to not have these Chicago people impose their politics.
And this is true in many states in the U.S., and my guess is not just in the U.S. My guess is it's true in other places that with increasing urbanization, the split between people who live in the city where more of the resources seem to reside and people who live in more rural or frontier areas where there seem to be fewer resources. It feels like, what do you mean we're in the same state?
Wouldn't that just produce more Republican senators?
Well, there's all sorts of things to think about there.
Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry.
but that's on the tactical level, yeah. Other divides that haven't been named that seem significant that people mention.
Gentrifiers and locals.
Gentrifiers and locals. So by locals, you mean people that have been there a while? And gentrifiers, people that are showing up now?
Yeah.
And it also points back to who owns and who doesn't?
Yeah.
Okay. Others? Yeah.
Age.
Age, huge, yeah. And it shows up in lots of ways.
Exactly. For me, it summarizes a lot of things, like education, or divides in that, or international versus not, language, skills, international versus not, all of that.
Great. Maybe even like familiarity with technology is, I mean, you keep going. When you name, a lot of these divides, you name one and it actually immediately suggests a host of others. There was another hand right in front, Sam, sorry.
Ethnicity and nationality.
Ethnicity and nationality.
Yeah, as a person who came from Saudi Arabia but is Eritrean by nationality, there was a large divide between the Saudis and the Eritreans, so there's that divide.
Yeah, and so that question about globalization, when Dewey talked 100 years ago, and when he said, Plato and Rousseau, they did not imagine the complexity that we now have to think about. That was 100 years ago. So whatever Dewey was detecting has only been increased greatly along cultural and ethnic lines and lots of other lines. The mobility we have right now. I'm saying all this just to point back to the question of, remember, if the big question is self-rule, and if the question right below that is, how do we constitute a collective self? These are all challenges to constituting a collective self. There were a couple other hands there. Florian.
I had 3 different sort of definitions of home.
Yeah.
So in my neighborhood, it's education, sort of formally speaking,
Yeah.
you know, what your highest school leaving degree is,
Yeah.
more specifically whether you've got the Abitur or not.
Okay.
It correlates with all sorts of things. Like
Okay.
if I draw a circle of like 700 meters
Yeah.
in my house. In terms of my home region in Germany, which is very far away from Berlin, it's not urban versus rural, because it's all very mixed,
Uh-huh.
but it's, I guess I would say, indigenous versus not.
Okay.
People who have been there for more than a generation, and
Okay.
else. And in terms of my family, which is half American and half German, it's all about food. The real divide stuff.
Food.
Yeah.
Great. A very concrete way to think about it. And then I think there was one more hand. Yeah.
Well, I said like origin like well off versus deprived, and
Okay.
that can also, I think that's mainly financial, but it links to race, education, class, gender, a lot of other things. So
Okay. So we've named many divides. Each one of them, if we took it on its own, it would be significant. Did it feel tense talking about it with a couple people in here? Naming it? No?
Not yet.
Not yet. It probably won't get too tense tonight, but we'll see. We can hope. We can hope for more tension. What I want to do is I actually want to push from those mentions of divides. I guess I want to note that at least in the United States, and not only in the United States, there's like a industry that says we're too divided to work together. Over and over and over again. You can go into almost any room. I live in this strange state, Oregon, which is divided in all sorts of ways. We hear it from pollsters and other people. And if you ask, does it feel like divides are a significant problem? Everybody will shake their head and say yes, or nod their head. Yes, it does. And then if the next question is, like, what is your municipal government doing about that? Or what are the charitable foundations doing? There's no commensurate response. So I guess I want to just float as a question for you, which right now is merely meant to be rhetorical. Like, where are the examples you point to think this is work to try to get us connected across differences and across divides? To just put that in your head. And I want to put that in your head because I want to turn briefly to the work that this organization I'm with does. I want to give 4 examples of different kinds of work and then push back to the question of how we might rule ourselves. And I also want to mention a couple other folks like Dewey who have done a lot of thinking about this. So I'm going to name 4 programs. I'll name them, I'll say a quick word about them. One of them, and I'll name the one that's most obviously about divides first, it's called Bridging Oregon. So one way to deal with divides, try to work on bridges. It's a sappy metaphor, but it's quickly resonant for people. The way this works is we go into different regions of the state, and for 4 half days over a 2-month period, so every 2 weeks or so, we gather 30 people, the same 30 people, for a half day, to talk about the divides in their community. And we try to recruit that group to make sure it's diverse along a few different axes, many of which reflect the divides you mentioned, but all of them have some relationship to access to power. So that is, we want to make sure there are some people with very little formal education and some people with significant formal education. Some people on the lower end of the wealth and income spectrum, some people on the higher end. Some people who are from a group that's had privilege in that area for a while, some people that haven't. Some people for whom English is a first language, some people for whom it's not. Some people from the dominant religious tradition in the area, some people from other religious traditions in the area. So try to get 30 people together and just have them get to know each other and talk about divide. And it can get tense. But the 3 things we're after in that program, and I want to name these 3 things because I think coming back later to the question of self-rule, I want to suggest these are really important to self-rule, and they show up even down to how do you evaluate whether this particular program works. First thing we're after is trust and relationships. The second one is going to point back to what David said toward the end of his introduction. The second thing we're after is inquiry and reflection. And then the third thing we're after is a sense of agency and commitment. So I'll just say those again. Trust in relationships, inquiry and reflection, agency and commitment. It's a program with not a ton of reach. It goes region to region, 30 people over a couple month period. Right now it's happening on the north coast of Oregon. Next year it'll be out in the southeast of Oregon, which is where, I don't know if any of you heard about the occupation of the Malheur Refuge. Is a smile there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I can ask you more about the smile later, but there were lots of divide. This was, with the question of popular sovereignty in mind, this was in rural Oregon. It was basically a question about who owned the land, how much the government owned the land, who the land ought to belong to. And it was really very much about who was sovereign, where, and why. What was the logic for it? So that's one program, Bridging Oregon. I'm going to name 3 others pretty quickly just to get them out on the table. The next one's called the Conversation Project. And that is what it sounds like. Now we run about 300 of these a year around the state of Oregon. Each one is a 90-minute one-off conversation that a local community has requested from a catalog of different topics that we curate. So it could be, why aren't there more black people in Oregon? That's one topic. It could be, what do we want from the wild, which is about our relationship to the outdoors. It could be about any number of things. All those topics come from people who live in Oregon who propose a topic to us, not because they're experts in the topic, but because the question is alive for them and they think it would be important for people to talk about. So I'm going to point from Conversation Project to the third one, which is we train people to lead challenging conversations. So training. And we use training also as an excuse to have 25 people in a room together for 2 days at a time talking about tough questions. So because they're forward pointed, because they think I'm going to come out of here with more skills, we have a reason to have them really listen to each other, talk to each other, do some serious reflection, and think about how they're going to apply the skills going forward. And then the fourth one is the lowest barrier of them all. It's a program called Dear Stranger. It's a letter exchange program where we put out a question, like tell us something about your community that you think people don't understand about it. They send the letter to us. We then swap it with someone from a different zip code. Ideally, if we're getting it from an urban zip code, we swap it with someone from a rural zip code. And then they're off. So those are 4 examples of ways that we're trying to work across divides and start building some of the stuff that I think is necessary. Again, not the legal or institutional stuff, but the fabric stuff for us to be able to understand each other enough to constitute a collective self. So I want to actually stop for a minute because I've been talking more than I hoped to. And I just want to see if anybody has either questions or thoughts about either the programs themselves or the reasons for them. Yeah, Aaron.
So, based on what you've described just now, it sounds like the programs are, I'm not sure if this is the right way to put it, but I would say maybe content-less in the sense of not aimed at any particular policy, right, but rather in some type of belief that people should be connecting regardless of the positions that they hold, or something along those lines, right? Is that somewhat fair, right? That you're not pushing any particular political agendas.
We are not invested in a particular policy outcome, and the goals of all of those programs have more to do with those 3 things I mentioned: trust and relationships, inquiry and reflection, agency and commitment. But the hook is often a topic.
So that was the form. Now
You're
my
getting ready for your question.
Yeah, exactly. That was not my question. That was just those of you who are actively involved, right? You and your other staff members, right? How diverse politically are the actual people who are doing this work?
It's a really good question. So one thing we've worked on over the past 4 years is diversifying the range of, we call them facilitators, in lots of ways. And political diversity is actually lower in our goals of the diversity we're seeking than other forms. So we used to have a group, and I should say that it's mostly not our staff that leads these programs. It's mostly people that do other kinds of work, all sorts of other work. Some of them are in nonprofits or education, but some of them in social services, some of them chaplains. There's a wide range of things. There are people who have gone, another program we run is a college program for adults living on low incomes, and we've had people who have come through that program who now lead conversation projects. So we've tried to really increase the age diversity, the ethnic and cultural diversity. We've tried to make sure that many people who lead those programs have not seen themselves in situations like this before. So that means largely education and access to power again. So we're trying to support people in stepping up to have this role in community conversations that maybe didn't ever think before, I get to be leading a group of people to have this discussion. So we have many fewer people with advanced degrees leading these than we ever used to have. Age is corresponding with that as well. We don't aim for a red-blue split of like 40 Republicans, 40 Democrats. But I can tell you that when we run Bridging Oregon, and I was just the third leg on a three-legged stool of facilitators for a program we ran in Southern Oregon, the two main facilitators were on strongly different political sides. And I didn't know how different until we got to the third of those 4 half-day sessions. And that was incredibly productive. And I actually think one thing I haven't said yet that's important to say is the 3 goals I mentioned, we think about how those are going to affect 3 different groups of people. The first group is the obvious one, participants. So the people that show up for a conversation project, the people that write into Dear Stranger, the people that participate in Bridging Oregon. The second group that we think about is partner organizations. Who's hosting this stuff and why, and what is the impact of this on them and their organizations? And then the third, and what I think is the most important group, is the facilitators themselves. Because what we're doing is we're deliberately building a core of people who start to see themselves as devoted to building community and gaining skills for it. And I want to go back to Whitman in a minute on that one. Yeah. So thank you for those 2 questions. Other questions or thoughts on those? Yeah.
My first question is, how do you, so if you could say a little bit more about how you get the participants in a conversation, like how do you choose them?
Yeah.
Like do you approach it different? And then my second question is, like, in these conversations, if, like, what is the goal, the main goal? Like, is it to reach a common conclusion? Like, do you want to have one conclusion, or what is it, what's the outcome?
Great. So to your first question first, how do we get the people? Sometimes we try to get them, sometimes they just come. So Bridging Oregon, we're very deliberate about recruitment. It takes 2-3 months to get that group of 30 people from a bunch of backgrounds together. Conversation project, we work with a partner organization to get the word out, and whoever shows up, shows up. That college program for adults living on low incomes, the recruitment is very targeted, but there's a real range there. Okay. Should I go to the second question?
Just quickly on this, how do you motivate? What motivates you to participate?
I wanted to go back to the class David just taught and say butter is what motivates people, but that's not the only thing. It really varies. I think it's one of the interesting things in doing the work is seeing who are the organizations that are already convening people in some way. And sometimes the motivation is compulsory, but often it's voluntary. And increasingly we are partnering with workplaces, from law firms to higher ed to, you could just keep going. There's a really kind of, anybody heard of the Tillamook Cheese Factory? So they're a huge dairy in Oregon. They're now hosting conversation projects for their employees. And they have employees from a few different places in Oregon and now across the country. And they think it's important. I just led a conversation with the Tillamook Cheese Factory staff about the middle class and other stories about wealth, status, and rank. So during most of the day, they're working on marketing their cheese, and we took 90 minutes in the middle of the day to talk about class. So where we go is going to determine a lot about how we get.
Why did they want to do that?
Great. Yeah. I think the language is going to be different in different places, but they want the people that work there to be more connected to each other, more connected to their work, and more connected to their state. They want the combination of reflection and inquiry, trust and relationships, and a sense of agency and commitment. That's not the language they use. They're going to have words like retention, team dynamic, morale. But I think it corresponds pretty well to the words we're using. If we're going to market hard to that, we'd have to get their words down. I don't want to lose the second question about goals, which I said a little bit about goals before, but because you asked about consensus, I think it's related to Aaron's question too. No, consensus is not what we're after. In fact, it may be that people disagree more strongly and more clearly at the end of a conversation than they did before it, but the hope is that they understand each other more. That they see other human beings more clearly, and maybe that they understand themselves more. So, not necessarily agreement, but more trust. Florian.
Yeah, I think that's valuable, and I don't want to all
But
be
bring it.
perceived as
bring it.
attacking it.
Yeah.
But I guess what's on my mind slightly
Yeah.
is that it's often been observed by various political scientists that when you look at the positions that sort of define divides across the board in modern societies, they tend to be quite similar, but the big standard is the United States, not in what those divides are, but where the divide falls. In other words, the middle of the discussion is much further to the right on a whole lot of subject matters in the States than it is in just about any European country, than it is in Japan, etc. This isn't true across the board, but there's something wrong and perhaps slightly dangerous about thinking of these divides just in terms of, or primarily in terms of polarization between people who can't talk with each other anymore. There is that, but it's not both sides equally when you just take a comparative perspective.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, to what extent this kind of or these kinds of project reflect that. To what extent they could be assailed, and I'm not assailing them because I don't know enough, as sort of part of normalizing where the discourse happens to be, which from a European perspective, a comparative perspective, no matter whether you are on the left or on the right, it's just a whole lot further to the right from anything, just about any issue that you can think of.
I love that your question started with the phrase various political scientists observe. I just think that's just a funny start to any question. So thank you for that. It's not where we start our programs. Like nothing we do starts with various political scientists observe.
I understand that.
Most of them, if not all of them, start with the community where the conversations are taking place. So the first question, the first day of Bridging Oregon, is sort of like the question I asked you. What are some divides you perceive in your community? And builds from there. So they're not taking divides that have been thrust on them by others, they're naming the divides themselves and then working on them with each other. In a way, the particular divide matters less than naming it and working on it together. A couple more questions. Can I read one quote from Dewey and then we'll go here and we'll get these other? It'll be very quick.
I wanted to cite your quote.
You did?
The one from earlier.
Okay.
It was the problem of being able to form a political community where you don't know everyone. Our political states, our political nations are so big that what we perceive as a political community in modern terms is never going to have that personal aspect. So I see you trying to build a personal political community that might not exist in modernity and might not be able to exist.
In Germany, there's not even a word for it. Right?
Okay, so
there's the famous Gemeinschaft, the
yeah,
community,
so you're both
Gesellschaft,
making
and society.
you're both making the argument that the work is devoted to. I want to get you in and then go back to Dewey real quick.
Sure. So you referenced a program where you teach people how to lead difficult conversations.
Yeah.
First, what is that called?
Facilitation training.
Okay.
We don't have a fancy name.
Okay.
We need one.
So follow up to that. So you talked about how it fosters a situation where people are already inclined to be better listeners.
Yeah.
Right, which is great that there's kind of this underlying goal of we're going to put people in a place where they're already there to listen to each other. But do you address the fact that if you're teaching someone to lead a difficult conversation, they're generally leading people who don't want to listen, and so there's this inherent weakness in that interaction?
So it's great. Florian used the word, I don't want to assail, and then said, but. And you said, well, I have this question, which is like, do you address this difficulty? And here's what I want to say. The difficulties you're naming are the reasons to do this. The challenges to it are precisely the goals. So the fact that people don't seem to listen to each other is the thing we're working on. And that's why, for me, actually, listening is, when I think about what does it take for a community to rule itself, what does it take to constitute a people, I think we need to learn how to listen to each other. And I don't say that without an understanding of how difficult it is. This is the core activity that I feel like I've been working on for 20-some years, is how is it that we create conditions for people to listen across differences. So really helpful that you named it there. I want to quickly, hey, come on in. How's it going? Okay? All right, sounds good. A couple quick words from Dewey and Whitman to maybe keep provoking questions or strong reservations. So to go back to the comment about Dewey, I'm going to go back to Dewey a couple more times here. And I don't know if people here have read the book Public and Its Problems, but it's a few chapters. Again, it's about 100 years old. If you're interested in community life, I would recommend it. Here's one line from there. In its deepest and richest sense, a community must always remain a matter of face-to-face intercourse. Vital and thorough attachments are bred only in the intimacy of an intercourse which is of necessity restricted in range. Later in the same passage, democracy must begin at home, and its home is the neighborly community. Say one more from him there. Unless local community life can be restored, the public cannot adequately resolve its most urgent problem, to find and identify itself. And I should say something that I haven't said yet here, which is Dewey is really good at recognizing that we group up in lots of ways. We associate in lots of ways. What we don't do very much is associate in a democratic public sort of way. We associate by religion, or by the football team we like, or you name it, by the neighborhood we live in. But we don't often get together to try to constitute a democratic public. There are all these competing publics. And so he's trying to say, here's how you might constitute a democratic public that's going to be capable of self-rule. So, earlier I talked about how we're not working on legal and institutional stuff. I think legal and institutional stuff is important, but that's where a lot of attention goes, and what we're trying to do is focus where there's less attention and what I think is a necessary but not sufficient condition for self-rule, and that is increasing opportunities to listen to each other so that we can understand ourselves and constitute a collective self. And I want to just go back to that not very happily named training for a minute. Say, like, what kind of training would it take for us to get better at ruling ourselves? Not so much as individuals, but as collectives, as communities. And I want to read two quotes from a different book. This is from Walt Whitman, who's a poet. And so why would you read a poet when you're talking about political things? But Whitman has a book called Democratic Vistas. Anybody read Democratic Vistas? Okay. To me, it's just a shock how that book has been forgotten. Because you read that book and it's like, it's a poet who's doing some prophecy. So Couple lines from Democratic Vistas. Here's the first one. I say the mission of government, henceforth in civilized lands, is to train communities through all their grades, beginning with individuals and ending there again to rule themselves. The mission of government is to train communities, beginning with individuals and ending there again to rule themselves. So he's talking about popular sovereignty. And he's talking about training that's necessary to get there. So that's where I want to go back to in just a minute. I want to get Whitman out here one more time. The purpose of democracy, this is Whitman again, is to illustrate at all hazards this doctrine or theory that man properly trained in sanest, highest freedom may and must become a law and series of laws unto himself. The purpose of democracy. That man properly trained in sanest, highest freedom may and must become a law and series of laws unto himself. So maybe I can stop for just a minute and ask, what the hell kind of training is he talking about? What kind of training do you think would be required for us to do this work? How do we train ourselves to rule ourselves?
You have to know what you want.
You have to know what you want. How do you train people to know what they want? And did you mean a singular you or a plural you when you said know what you want? Either. How do you get people to know what they want or what you want? How do we get to know what we want? Might be another way to say it. Can I push you a little bit? How do you think you could get, like, how could we get to know, how can we get trained in knowing what we want together?
Reflection.
Reflection? Okay. That was like a guilty laugh because it was the answer David wanted?
No, a guilty laugh because I haven't come up with a better answer to it for myself.
I see. So it's a partially, it's the answer you know best right now, but you're not totally confident that that's the right answer or the full answer?
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Actually, in relation to that, I think it's important to first have people believe or know that they can want something.
To know or believe that they can want something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which also goes, I just had a quick comment also on listening, that I think, first of all, like, people need to be able to speak right, and I don't think that we should take that for granted.
Agreed. And that's why I think anytime there's a group of people together, for me, it's important that people talk in small. Like this, the way this room is arranged right now is not the way most rooms are arranged that I'm in. And when we train people to do community work, we're usually aiming for circles rather than rows. And we're almost always getting people talking in pairs, triads, whole group, lots of different ways, so that everyone's voice is heard. And so that we just get practiced at listening. Because the way most public meetings are set up, for example, they're set up for people that have talked to groups before, and they're set up for people to talk at each other. They're not set up for listening. We take turns talking. They're not set up for reflection. They're set up for us to say what we knew before to a group of people that is already dug in. So how can we, from design of a program to how we actually name the goals of gatherings, how can we start making it more likely that we will listen to each other and even surprise ourselves by what we're thinking about and what we're saying, so that we can think fresh about what we want and think there might be some goal with each other of getting closer to it. So the question I asked was about training, and I want to keep it up there a little longer.
Mediation and communication.
Mediation and communication. Yeah, which is like, how do we get better at talking to each other? Both of those, especially when there's conflict. Because there is conflict. Again, the bigger the group, the more diverse the group in any number of these ways, what we're talking about is difference, and we're talking about loss, often. Either historical loss, present loss, or future loss. And it's often serious loss. And I think one of the big difficulties with knowing what we want is that we've gotten different amounts of what we want. Not all of us expect the same thing about what we could possibly want. So how can we do this? So I want to point to one more thinker, the last The last reading suggestion I think I'll make, which is Danielle Allen, who's a contemporary political theorist, who has a book called Talking to Strangers, which looks at various points mostly in American history, but not only that. Her first book is actually about the Athenian justice system. But in Talking to Strangers, she talks a good bit about what citizenship requires, and her emphasis there is on trust. And I just want to get a little bit of her words out there. One thing she says, citizenship is not fundamentally a matter of institutional duties, but of how one learns to negotiate loss and reciprocity. What she's pointing to is methods of trust production. She says, distrust is the core challenge, and now I'm quoting, it can be overcome only when citizens manage to find methods of generating mutual benefit, despite differences of position, experience, and perspective. So I guess I just want to we didn't have the word trust out earlier too explicitly when we were talking about key verbs or activities for working across difference or ruling ourselves, and I guess I want to say trust is a big one. And to think, how do you build trust? And I would even say, I would encourage you over the next couple days as you walk around, as you walk through your usual day, just to start thinking, where do I feel like I trust someone, or where don't I? What are the conditions that lead to me feeling like I trust this person?
So one of the things, just thinking at the group level of training.
Yeah.
Right. So where I come from, you might say that you could train people to not interrupt other people when they talk, and that would help facilitate a conversation.
Yeah.
But I'm told that in France, interrupting someone is a sign that you're interested in what they have to say, and if you don't interrupt them, it's a kind of offense or something like that. So even at the root level of practices that one could train, is there any kind of, do you find that there's something we could lay hold of in a cosmopolitan, like a diverse, a community as diverse as this one?
First of all, I was so tempted to interrupt you that whole time. I just wanted to slam in and interrupt and say, New Jersey, you're from New Jersey. Yeah, it's true that there are great varieties of ways we interact comfortably. But I think everybody wants to be listened to. Now, in some cultures, eye contact is part of that listening, and in some cultures it's not. And in some cultures, it's okay to interrupt people after a minute, and in others, you gotta wait half an hour. But behind that is the listening. And I haven't yet, I'm not saying I've worked on this in an infinite range of cultures, but I have never yet been in a place where people don't want to be listened to. And I think people will go out of their usual norm of conversation if they feel like it is for listening and being listened to. And there are ways to model that, and there are ways to structure it. So I guess I would start with that keeping the simple, big goal in mind. And one example is circles rather than rows, as I said before. Another is always to be asking people to pair or triple up. And especially to pair or triple up with people they don't know, or know way too well. And to ask questions that don't require expertise, but do require reflection about personal experience. And to tell people, here's one where it starts to get risky, or at least to provoke discomfort in places. I like, no matter what group I'm with, I like for people to introduce themselves with their first names, and then I ask them some question that's related to the topic. So if we're talking about, say, divides, I might say, all right, tonight at this hospital where we're talking about care, I want you to all just, let's all introduce ourselves with our first name and then say first word that comes to you when you hear the word care. And then what that means is that doctors, nurses, orderlies, chaplains are all immediately at some sort of the same level. You've removed the doctor part. So that now in some places, the honorific matters. So where can you do that and where can you not do that? Right. So, your question is right on, but I think, again, the big goal and modeling that even if I don't know the specifics, what it's for, people will respect. They want that space. So we gotta find ways to create it, and usually the best ways to find the details is to talk to people and listen to them who are in that community, and probably the facilitators ideally are from that community, or one of the two facilitators is. So you can learn more about it. It's an incomplete answer, but we do these trainings over 2 days, so. Yeah, Aaron.
I'm wondering if you have anything to say about moral certainty. I can say a little bit more about what, it seems to me that moral certainty is actually one of the biggest obstacles to achieving maybe some of the things that you're talking about. And actually, my sense is that actually if I were to press some of the people who said things that sounded good in this room today about how you want, communication and build communication and listening, whatever, once they're in a situation where there was somebody who they're morally certain is wrong, that's might go out the window.
Yep.
And so to bring it to connect it perhaps to trust is the last thought, just because you said, because I'm not sure if Danielle is right that trust is the biggest challenge, but maybe here to connect to is that maybe it's easy for us to trust those that share our moral certainty.
So our goal is, so moral certainty or certainty of any kind, especially about a set of beliefs or another person, is something we're trying to unsettle from the get-go. And this is where I think reflection is a key part of the kind of interaction we're trying to create. So if, for example, just to go back to the conversation project called What We Want from the Wild.
Yeah.
In Oregon, the relationship to the land is a hot button issue. Who owns it, who manages it, what's done on it, what's my relationship to it. And it's not an abstract issue. It's like how I make my daily life and what does my family mean kind of issue. So how can you get people to step back from what they're certain about so that suddenly they're open again to ask a question? Might be, instead of saying, what do you think about this policy? You're saying, all right, here's how I want us to start. I want you to think of a time you went to what you think of as the wild to try to get something you needed. You decide what you mean by the wild and whether the thing is abstract or could be a fish, could be a sense of peace. Think about that for a minute, and then I want you to talk to two people you don't know who are thinking about the same question. And what that does is, all three of them, no matter what they're morally certain about, are experientially familiar with going to the wild for something. And so even if they have a different sense of what the policy should be, they start to build a shared sense of what the bigger thing means to them. And it may be that after 90 minutes they still think, I can't believe that guy believes that we shouldn't be able to have 4x4s going on the top of these mountains. But I know your name, I've heard why you care about it, maybe I've heard a personal story, and it starts to build, again, trust, but not consensus necessarily. This is ongoing, underlying work. And it takes, I should say, I haven't said this yet, it takes a really long time, and it's never done. But it is, in my view, it's the necessary accompaniment to the legal and institutional work on self-rule. It's the relational work and the constant reflective work, ideally together, ideally building towards a stronger sense of agency. Let's go here.
Are you worried at all that people will be interacting with all of these different people who have all of these polarized viewpoints, and as a result of that become just totally complacent? I've met this guy and they have this opinion, mine is the opposite. He was nice, so I just won't vote, I won't be engaged, because either way it seems overall pretty fine.
Great. That's a great question. I think I'm concerned about a lot of things with what this can't do on its own. I think this is a complementary activity. And I actually think organizing and mobilizing is also important, but every organization has to decide where it's going to do the work that it thinks it can handle. And I will say that this is related to that question about reflection before. There's a funny thing that I've seen happen, which is the more challenging the conversation, and in a way the more the difficult stuff gets raised, the more people seem to be committed to wanting to work on it. I actually think talking about this stuff with people who don't necessarily agree, and who are willing to say the hard stuff rarely leads to complacency, although I hear what you're saying. I think what makes people more complacent is like a one-off employee trip to volunteer at the food bank, move some cans, call it good. It's a little harder once the questions are inside of you and alive and are attached to other people. If you meet other people who have perspectives and backgrounds other than yours, the ideas are no longer just ideas. It's harder to set them aside. Couple, can we go to the very back row? So that, yeah.
I'm guessing you are from Oregon, yes?
Well, I'm from Chicago, but I live in Oregon now.
Right. Well, the question is more or less connected. I grew up with this phrase, and I think it's quite common in Latin America, that you nourish the land that you spring from, or something like that to translation. So how do you feel it's important to you? And I guess most of us here are living in a diaspora.
Yeah.
To have it be connected to the place you maybe grew up.
That's actually it's a really beautiful question, and we haven't talked about place much, but I think place is often the way in to the difficult questions, especially when you have people who disagree with each other. Because most people have a strong attachment to place. And that can be a way to start getting people to recognize, oh wait, you are also connected to this place. You who I disagree with in all sorts of ways also care about this place. I will say my family is mostly like a wandering family. And so, weirdly, we design a lot of programs that are based in place. We ran a statewide series of discussions called This Place. And then we brought people together from lots of different communities that had that conversation. We ran an online set of storytelling called This Land, where we asked artists of color to tell stories about how communities of color had been affected by land policy in Oregon. And we brought all those stories together on what we called one digital canvas, which is a fancy way of saying a website. But putting all those stories together to go, look, here's the story about the big story about place, built up by all these smaller stories. I think place is actually related to what Dewey said about the local. I just was in a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine who lives in Hawaii. And her sense of attachment to place and tradition is much stronger than mine. Much, much stronger. And I have a lot of envy for it, and I don't have as much experience of that strong rooting in place myself. And so for me, it's much more about the people than the place. I think it would be better if I could choose it myself if it were both. Maybe I want to respect the time, so maybe one more question, and then I want to close with one last short reading.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it happened before that people got hurt. I wouldn't use the word offended because I think it had other connotations than what I mean, but hurt by what was said.
Yes. I mean, I can just say, I may be interrupting New Jersey style, but the short answer is yes. And then I would say, anytime people are getting hurt or offended by what someone said in one of these conversations that we work on, the hurt is there before. The cause of the hurt is there. What's not there is opportunities to talk it through. And so we have to be comfortable with some place to go, yeah, that hurts, and let's keep talking about it. We don't have enough spaces to work through what hurts. Instead, it often lies under, it comes out in ways that are not productive. So these are devoted to trying to work through it. So I don't, for example, use the phrase safe space for two reasons. The first is, I can't ever guarantee that the space is safe. People are going to feel hurt. And the second is, I don't think it's desirable. We ought to be able to challenge ourselves and to say that up front. And the harder the topic of conversation, the more we probably need to name up front that this could be tough. I think we can handle it. Let's work on it. But this is part of the training that, David, you were asking about, is like, how do you make it more likely that people are going to be able to have tough conversations? Well, there are techniques. There are a lot of techniques you can have. Maybe one more question. Maybe two more questions.
Yeah, I was just a little bit uncertain about when earlier you used the word citizen.
Yes, great.
Isn't it already limited?
Yeah, I don't like the word citizen. That was Danielle Allen's word.
Okay.
I'm completely with you. It's not that I don't like the word citizen, it's that I think it does right away start to separate, starts to create divides. So, and that's what's nice about your question is it reminds all of us that from the beginning of a program description to how you get people in the room, to what you talk about in the room, how can you tilt towards more inclusive rather than divisive? And citizen in the United States right now is a loaded word. So thank you, that's really helpful. Yeah, Ava, before
Can
we
you
take-
have a community without a divide?
Can you have-
Just echoing this, but my question was a different one. I wanted, before you read your last quote, I wanted to put some issue out there. So one divisive issue on this campus
Yeah,
is about the so-called curriculum. What do we read and why?
the so-called curriculum.
And the banner is, we want diversity. Everybody wants diversity. Who on earth doesn't want diversity? The issue is, how do we understand that? What do we mean by that, and so on. But what do we read, right? So I noticed that you read to us. I was paying attention about the selection and thinking about the rationale.
Okay.
I have comments on this, but they're not for now. But I'm wondering, do you present or do you use readings?
Yeah, great.
Right,
That's
how
what I
do
was
you
going to
do it?
finish. You anticipated, I think, or I'm just going there because I thought you might. One of us anticipated. But maybe is that a related question?
No, it's actually different.
Okay, then can I respond to that one? Often, the conversations are rooted in a text. The text doesn't need to be a reading, but for me, it often is. And that's to provide a shared experience, a shared object of attention, something people can go at that is not another individual, something that will provoke reflection and get people thinking fresh. So for example, I'll go back to that what we want from the wild. Sometimes I'll use images, but my favorite thing to use for that topic, even in like places you wouldn't expect. So I'll go into rural Oregon, and at a certain point in that conversation, usually fairly early on, anybody know the Robert Frost poem, The Most of It? Okay, there's another recommendation for thinking about what the wild means to us. But thinking about where the readings come from, who writes them, what perspectives are there, that's a huge part of selecting readings. And so I mentioned Dewey, Whitman, and Danielle Allen. I think you could go lots of places to get whether the readings you're using. Those are not things I use in conversation, in community conversation. That was more here in a university setting to try to, that was that theoretical finery I was talking about. I was trying to put a gloss on the work. It helps me think about it, but in communities, having conversations, I'm trying to use an object that everyone's going to have access to, that's going to be short enough to come off the page and raise the questions. And I actually want to close by reading one that I sometimes use after going through this question.
My question is, during the trainings or your work, do you face hate speech? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Great. That's actually related to a couple other questions. You know what? I face it less than some of our other trainers, probably because I'm a 50-year-old white guy. And what we found is that, this is not going to be surprising, that over the past 3 years, especially, there's been an increase in hate speech and intimidation towards people who are trying to get the tough topics talked about, especially when those people are themselves people of color in Oregon. Now, there's good news with that. The good news is there's more appetite for it. Communities that I think historically have been really rough places for people of color to live are recognizing that they have work to do. And they're trying to have the tough conversations. But as they do that, there are some people, not many, but some, in some of these communities who are uncomfortable with them. And so one thing we've had to do just on a very tactical level, we've had to start budgeting for security in some contexts. And that doesn't mean alerting the local police, because in some cases they are part of the problem. We work more with host organizations on how do you do outreach and what do you do if something comes up. And we work closely with our facilitators on trying to increase their level of comfort and let them know that if it feels wrong, it's your call. Because that stuff is real. I do think these two things have gone together. Increased appetite for the hard conversations, and in a way that's the silver lining of a lot of the more inflammatory talk in the US right now, is that many more people want to talk about this stuff. It's easier for me to make a case for this work now than it was 4 years ago. It puts more pressure on some of our facilitators because of the bodies they show up in. And it's put more pressure on us as a staff to support them. Okay, I said this is going to be the last one. Is it really, really short? Yeah.
In the light of this,
Yeah.
and what you're trying to accomplish, is it not maybe, when you call it the great goal or the big goal or something, isn't it a bit too ambitious to go for something like self-rule and
Yes.
Whitman and all of that? Isn't like not hitting each other over the head and still, living together in some sort of modern, diverse society quite enough as a goal, quite challenging enough? I mean, isn't self-rule, I know, popular sovereignty and so on, we asked you to talk about that, right?
That's some of
But
it.
isn't it a bit of a red herring, possibly, because it's so ambitious?
Yeah. I mean, if we don't want to rule ourselves in community, then why do we keep talking about democracy? And if we do want to do it, then we ought to name it and try to work towards it. Like, I take your question seriously, and okay, another book, Miles Horton, The Long Haul. It's called The Long Haul for a reason. So that's sort of my answer to that question. I want to go back to listening and close with a poem. And before reading the poem, I want to say thank you. Adrienne Rich poem called What Kind of Times Are These? I'm just going to read it and then call it good. There's a place between two stands of trees where the grass grows uphill and the old revolutionary road breaks off into shadows near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted who disappeared into those shadows. I've walked there picking mushrooms at the edge of dread, but don't be fooled. This isn't a Russian poem. This is not somewhere else but here, our country moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods meeting the unmarked strip of light, ghost-ridden crossroads, leaf mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. And I won't tell you where it is. So why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees. So I want to say thank you again for the invitation. And I'll hang out here as long as it makes sense to hang out, but really a pleasure to be here. And so, thanks.